Brian Shmaefsky is a professor of biology at Lone Star College. His research focuses on environmental physiology. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Welcome.
So I'd love to start just by hearing about what your journey has been to this work, and kind of how you came to be focusing on environmental physiology.
Okay, thank you for asking. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey with that because initially I actually wasn't going into the sciences. And then while I enrolled in my first biology courses in college, I got very interested in animal survival, and particularly in when I started taking my actual physiology classes, which is basically the chemistry of how a creature carries out its living processes. We did a very interesting study on physiological stress in rats, and we raised these rats for 16 weeks under stress conditions, under normal conditions, and under what we would call gluttony conditions, where the rat was overfed, taken care of, played with, and unfortunately, at the end of the experiment, we had to dissect the creatures and look at their physiological changes. And I was just amazed on how these creatures adapted over such a short time, and looked at how their body either increased their survival or decreased their survival under those conditions. So that really got me into wanting to know more and doing experiments on different types of stressors.
And so, what are some of those types of stressors in relation to the environment? I imagine heat would be one of them, but what are some other stressors that animals and plants experience?
Um, Heat, well, like you mentioned, temperature outside what's called their tolerance limits, which just means the extremes ups and downs, because they don't really look at cold and hot as much as how well is my chemistry functioning. We also could look at what we call hydration, water availability, um, what we call osmolarity, which means the amount of salt present in the body or other materials that act, metals or salts. And then there's um, factors like pollutants, and sometimes we call those xenobiotic chemicals. It means chemicals that don't quite work well in an organism's body.
So you mentioned that your work has been focusing more on plants lately. How is that different than looking at animals? Are you seeing different things, or are there what are the changes that you're seeing in plants as they adapt to environmental changes?
When I was working with animals, the thing about environmental change with animals is they can move away from whatever's causing their stress, or they could adapt behaviorally, which plants don't do. So they, like, if you're stressing an animal by not having its regular diet available, it will find other options. And I mean, it still undergoes a stress, but at least they're surviving. And they might not survive as long as they could, but enough to, carry on life. Um, Plants always kind of bugged me because, and this actually came from studying once a creature, an animal that could not move, and basically their response to stress and change was they died. And then I kept thinking, why don't plants? Why don't, because plants can't move. And what I've learned over time is that, plants have incredible adaptation systems, much more complex than animals, but also plants will, if they know things are going real quickly and they might not be able to adapt, they will reproduce. And that was kind of cool too, because we found application of that in agriculture, where if you want to increase, let's say, a fruit crop or a flower or a bunch of flowers, you put a plant under enough stress that it thinks it's going to die, but not quite. And then it just blossoms or produces fruit for its babies to live on past it. And that I found amazing. Some animals do that, but not as frequent as plants when they adapt.
So you said that when the plant's experiencing stress, it one of the things it does is it reproduces. Is that something that we can um, apply to how we think about like agriculture, or what are the applications of what you're learning about plants?
Yeah, so in agriculture, they do use stressors, to increase fruit production. It doesn't always work with leaf crops because the problem with leaf crops is plants under stress sometimes produce compounds that affect the taste of the food,
Mm.
or they'll become more fibrous. And the last thing you'd want to do is chew on lettuce that is kind of like full, like eating like bran or something like that, or eating something that's very full of fiber. So we do have a lot of applications for that, but we also have applications where certain plant responses to environmental change are beneficial in ways that, in my research, they can actually clean the environment. And
Oh,
this is in
wow.
a science called phytoremediation.
So what is that and how does it work?
So with phytoremediation, we we look for plants that are specifically adapted to very dramatic changes in the environment. And so we can look for plants that are um, high temperature resistant. And basically, what a lot of them do is they're able to produce almost alcohol type substances or antifreeze type substances in their bodies that keep them from freezing. Or like with trees, they just load their bodies up with sugar, such a high concentration of sugar that solution won't freeze. I mean, like if you put honey in a freezer, you'll see it crystallize, but it's still kind of liquidy, and that's what keeps them alive. When we look at super high temperatures, plants have ways of accelerating their cooling, or they sometimes shed parts, to reduce the heat damage to the body. When we start looking at, let's say, drought, some plants are able to again just shut down their systems, or what they'll do is they'll accumulate salts in their certain tissues as a way of drawing remaining water from the soil. And so I mean, there's all these incredible adaptations that we find that plants are good at, but we have to look for a plant in my field that is very good at a particular quality. The quality of plants I look for are ones that are able to break down poisons, because if you put poison in an environment with animals, they'll scatter if they're not killed by it. But with plants, they can't scatter, and it's not enough time with a pollution event for them to say, let's reproduce and get our kids out. They can't, if their kids might end up in pollution anyway. So these plants, some of them have just learned to take pollution, store them in the bodies, and also sometimes break down the pollutant into a nutrient source that they could use.
So that's super interesting. Can we train plants to do what you just described, or is it something that plants um, evolve to do? How does that work?
Um, Plants, well, all organisms evolved in a toxic world. So when we look at things like volcanoes producing horrible pollutants, we find natural arsenic and radiation in the soil. Um, we get flooding, we get droughts. So it's really a nasty world for everything. And they've had to have some adaptations along the way. But certain creatures in certain environments are more likely to encounter these, what I would call environmental stressors. So we look for creatures, well, particularly plants that have a particular environment they've grown up in, that they say, I have to have these characteristics or I'm a goner. And then we could exploit those characteristics to do, like in my field, to clean up petroleum. Because I mean, petroleum is a natural product. And there are plants that grew up in areas, particularly like in Greece and Italy, where you had a lot of petroleum coming out of, not, I shouldn't say petroleum, but crude oil and tar coming out of the ground, and plants had to survive that toxin.
Hmm.
Animals moved away from it. Plants adapted by being able to literally eat that material along with other organisms, soil organisms that help them do it.
So when thinking about some of those characteristics or capabilities of plants to clean up the environment, are there um, cost-effective ways to uh, utilize plants to help us with some ecological restoration, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I do most of my work in developing countries. So I'm always looking at cost-effective ways of cleaning up pollutants. And unfortunately, in some countries, let me give you an example. Bangladesh, I did a project a couple of years ago. Um, we were looking at a very nasty toxin called hexavalent fluoride, which in one, there's several forms of it, but in the form that was coming from this particular industry called the tanning industry, it was toxic to people, toxic to animals, and it was really having a negative effect on the environment. We could not shut down the industries, as that would have killed the economy. And sewage treatment was too expensive. I mean, you need electricity, you need an infrastructure to do it. So a team I was working with, we went into these tannery areas and we found plants that could absorb high levels of that fluoride, I mean, chromium compound, and then literally turn it into a neutral form that was the equivalent of like a vitamin. So what we've learned with these plants is they can take metals and salts, convert it to something safe that they can use for themselves if they grew up in that type of environment. So the plants that we were using were plants that normally grew in naturally toxic soils. You place them, literally, you build a sewage treatment plant out of them for these tanneries, and the plants literally produce clean water for you, at least for that particular contaminant. And it's cheap. I mean, these are not, now you can go to high end and genetically modify plants to do that. And that's also a big area. So we can take corn, for example, and genetically modify it to to handle high salt levels in the soil. It doesn't affect the corn itself, but it allows the corn to be able to survive droughts or what we call soil salinization. So we could go high tech route, which is a future, and that is getting less expensive as the technology becomes more refined. But there's also the way that what I would call is more sustainable, of looking more for plants that are easy to grow, native, and there's no cost to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if the those plants, if you're able to do that and clean up the waste from an industry, are those plants are they do they need to be native, or can those be used in different contexts to solve that same problem globally?
The best thing, and that's a good point you raised, the best thing are native plants. And it's not because you don't want to bring in an invasive plant or another or some type of plant that can take over or cause problems, but the native plants are adapted to that area. So you're not adding an accidental stressor that might interfere with the stress response to the pollutant. And that's a problem we're running into right now with some of the research, is that if we have a plant that we moved and it's under stress, it might not work well with the other stress response that's productive for what you're doing. Um, in most of the situations I've been in Southeast Asia and in South America, nobody cares if it's an invasive plant because we plant it, they work well, it grows up during the time that we need it, and then we just basically remove the plant. And um, you can burn it, turning into animal feed, whatever people want to do with it. There's a lot of time once the compound that we're taking out of the environment is in the plant breaks it down.
Hmm.
So literally you could use it for feed. People have used it for the plants for fibers, for, mulch, whatever, um, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing to hear that like the plant can clean up pollution. Um, the you mentioned some of the stressors that because of uh changes in the environment the plants have to deal with. One of the ones that I wanted to ask about was the both the flood and the drought, and the changes associated with those. Are the plants storing more water during drought and then um, using that to survive longer, or how do they get through periods of drought, and then what do they do when it's flooding?
So the drought responses, there's various types of drought responses. And the drought response is actually a natural response to metals and high metals and salts in the environment that are toxic to the plant. So we're kind of lying to you when we're telling you the plant is drought resistant. Okay, what we're trying to do is keep the plant from dying immediately. And this is particularly true in agriculture. This does not work if you're working with long-term plants like trees, let's say. So what happens with the drought response, it's really what we call a salt-tolerant response. And this response we call a halophyte response, which means basically response to salt. Halo for the term for salt. So what the plants do, instead of letting the salts into their tissues where they become dehydrated, the plants accumulate salt. And think about, like, you have this huge meal you want to eat, but you don't really want to eat it all at one time. So you store it in your cheeks like a chipmunk. And so these plants are literally storing all this salt in their cheeks. Their body is not becoming contaminated with salt, and they're living their life. Now, this can go on for so long. Now, the neat thing about storing salt in your body too, it acts as a water attractant. So literally, they are sucking water out of the soil and sometimes out of the air with some plants, is that using this high salt. So how does that work? Think about if you store salt in a shaker. The salt gets sticky and gummy because it's absorbing moisture from the environment. So plants could use that salt stress response too to try to milk the soil or the atmosphere out of as much water as they can. So you're basically prolonging the water availability of the plant. So when there is a drought, it's not an all or nothing thing. The
Mm,
plants can survive it a little longer than their colleagues who are dying of basically dehydration.
mm.
Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
so it's really a last minute thing before and they die, and hopefully it will rain or something like that before the period where they're about to die.
yeah. So then on the other side, in like a flooding scenario, what are they doing to either adapt or survive a flooding scenario?
And most of that, that's a difficult thing for plants to deal with. And most of the short-term survival is basically finding ways of getting oxygen to the roots.
Hmm.
Because the thing is that the roots are drowning. I mean, they can deal with low oxygen, but once you start getting water, um, starts pushing oxygen out from between the soil particles, then the roots start suffocating, to be honest.
Hmm.
And many plants don't have that adaptation where they can transport oxygen there. Some plants are clever, is what they do is they can produce a substance called peroxide, like hydrogen peroxide you use on a wound, and they'll ship the peroxide to their roots. And then there's a chemical called an enzyme that breaks down the peroxide into oxygen in the roots. Because
Huh.
normally if you try to pump oxygen, it gets used up along the way as it goes through the plant, but the peroxide gets transported immediately. So that's one weird adaptation that plants can do. I mean, our body does it in the skin. If you ever get
Hmm.
a cut and put, you know, something on this, hydrogen peroxide on the skin, our skin has the ability to break down hydrogen peroxide into oxygen. We use it in our bodies as a way to break down things, that reaction of producing oxygen from what we call peroxides. But certain plants can use it as a way to shuttle oxygen around the body.
Hmm.
It'd be great if humans could do that, but it's
Yeah.
we don't have the mechanism set up for it, at least now.
Right. Well, so I'm curious, what is the future of adaptation look like? What does the future of this work and research look like?
And that's a boy, that's an excellent question because botany, and any botanist listening to this is going to kill me. We tend to lag behind a lot with the other sciences, and a lot of it is because we're working with pretty stable creatures. And what we're starting to see now, though, is an increase in um, human-made materials like plastics, composite compounds. We're unearthing through mining minerals and materials that are normally not found in high concentrations in soil. So we're seeing that a lot of plants have to, and I'm not going to say learn, I'm just saying learn in a general sense, how to handle these new compounds. We're finding out that plants are a little slow right now on handling microplastics. And some of the sums associated with that, because unfortunately, a lot of the breakdown materials of plastics mimic plant hormones.
Mm.
And that's one thing that they have to get over, is that their bodies are being affected by something that's hard to fight. So there's going to be, so they're going to be, plants are going to be having to go into these decision trees or these evolutionary mechanisms where they can start finding ways of breaking down plastics, breaking down other materials without it resembling their own chemistry. And this is even true of our own body too, but not as much as what plants have to deal with.
Wow. Well, one more question I want to ask you, if you what advice would you give to people that are interested in environmental physiology and pursuing this as either an interest or as a researcher or in the profession?
Okay, I don't study humans, but my research affects how humans survive.
Mm.
And that's what I love about going into environmental physiology, not so much from the perspective of research, from the perspective of working like in agriculture, working in pharmaceuticals, and just working in industry in general. Um, but I do have former students that they've taken the road to looking at environmental stress in people as a public health issue. So and so they look at things like heat stress, and they find out that different age groups are affected by heat differently, and that heat itself doesn't kill. Is that what's going on? Particularly if a person's body can't regulate their temperature well, that's when heat becomes a problem. And literally a 1 to 5 temperature Fahrenheit difference in heat continuously over time could push an, a child or an older person to death. So we start looking at even climate change. The people that study public health and related to heat stress, they're very concerned that if higher than average temperatures are going to be around, the kill rate is going to be greater as temperatures stay hotter longer, because it's a time thing too. Stress responses are made to be immediate. They're not meant to be long term. And we'll learn this particularly for people. This is true of nutrition. So this is a really big area to go into. And even it's part of pharmacy right now. It's part of nursing and part of other fields where they now have to deal with the human as I deal with plants and my colleagues deal with animals, as how is this human behaving in the environment that they're living in. So a person that lives without air conditioning, let's say down where I live in Houston, their body's different than someone who lives in an air conditioned environment, and they have to be treated differently. So this is a whole, and this is going to be true for agricultural animals, plants, as we move along in a changing environment, and particularly with unpredictable changes.
Yeah. Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to share insights and your wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.